If you're wondering how to talk about gaps, setbacks, or academic failure in your medical school applications and interview, look no further. Today, we will share strategies and tips that will help you smooth over any potentially problematic elements of your academic and non-academic background.
Hi, my name is Janine. Sorry for the interruption. Before we get started, be sure to subscribe on whatever social media channel you're watching this so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. If you'd like to take advantage of our mentorship programs, schedule a free strategy call by visiting BeMoFreeStrategy.com. As a quick tip, check out the timestamps in the description to navigate to specific sections of the video that you're interested in. By the way, we're giving away Amazon gift cards every week to best comments and questions, so comment below for a chance to win. Now, let's get back to the video.
Please allow me to introduce myself and my colleagues who will help us tackle this difficult topic. My name is Yevgenia Kremchenkova. I'm a content developer here at BeMo. With me are Mang Yang, our associate manager of the consulting department, and Ronza Nissan, the associate director of the consulting department. And believe me, these ladies are absolute experts, so we're in good hands today. And before we start our discussion kind of point by point, I did want to start with this particular question. And the question is, from your experience, how many students actually ask you this question? How common is it for students to worry about their academic and non-academic background, their history, maybe something, failures or setbacks that they experienced in university, let's say? And I ask this because it seems to me that pre-med application process and interview process can be really isolating and lonely, and you might think that you're the only person out there who is experiencing this fear, this worry.
First, Jenya, thank you so much for having us on here. I think we're both super excited because this does tend to be a very sensitive topic and one that you mentioned, people feel like they're isolated in, but it's very common. It's very common to have this because there's so many experiences and vast amount of different avenues that you need to explore in your journey, that if you are lacking one, or if one is perhaps not the greatest, or you feel is not as competitive compared to maybe some of your peers, you're going to have that, insecurity about it. And you need to know how to strategize, how to tackle it in the best way possible, which I think that's what we're going to get into a little later on. But I think it's very important that we do bring it up and we do talk about it, because it's one that I've gotten lots of times, and I'm sure Meng has gotten lots of times also.
I'd say it's as common as it is to have those gaps, which is something I think Ronza already said, and that's pretty much, most of the applicants out there. It's a very hard path to go on, and most people don't have a perfect record, so everyone has that concern typically, and I get asked that question a lot, whether the concern is real and about something that they should actually talk about, or if it's just something small that they're worried about, but then we can basically resolve it just with a conversation.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, I hope that this discussion today will help students feel a little less lonely in this regard, because of course, everybody applies strategically, everybody looks for strengths and tries to overshadow or compensate for some maybe lacks. So it's really important for us to talk about this today. And I will start with the question, what if we were to address these gaps in application? What components of the application should the students use to address some gaps? And whether they should do it at all? Maybe there's a chance that the admission committee will not notice that maybe your GPA is not, matching their expectations, or maybe the MCAT is not that bad, or maybe research experience is not the top quality that you should have for medical school. So what would your advice be in terms of which components should address it and whether they should address those things at all?
Well, the primary application is a place where people will start to think about this question if you're applying to the States, for example. And some people will start thinking about it in terms of including it in the personal statement even. That is one place where it could get brought up, but I would say only if that gap was a significant one, and also if it helps you to address the question that you're trying to answer at all times when you're writing a personal statement, and that is, why do you want to be a physician? Right? If it helps you to address that, if there's something that you got from that experience that propelled you along that path and it's relevant to answering that question, then that might be one place where you could talk about it. Although, most people don't in that piece of writing because it doesn't often link to why they're pursuing medicine. I think probably one of the most direct places where you would be asked this question is in your secondary essays. If again you're applying through MCAT or TMD SAS, and if a school sends you a question, please address such and such gap in your record, then of course that's something that you would have to address. You wouldn't necessarily have a choice when you're given that kind of question.
Yeah, I agree with Meng here. I think it does vary on how significant it is. It could be across primaries or even the secondaries. But I think it's very important to note that you first have to identify if it is significant. Sometimes it's subjective. We don't really know how critical it is, or we might, think that it's critical, and then I've sat down with some students in the past and they're very insecure about X, Y, and Z. And then once I start talking to them, I'm like, well, no, I mean, look at all the abundance of other experiences that you've gained the qualities that you would get in X, Y, and Z. Honestly, it really does depend. But if you are, say, hoping to get into a research school or a school that's mission is driven on research and you're lacking research, yeah, I think that's pretty important to discuss on why maybe you didn't get that exposure. And I guess, we will tackle how to even address it. But the where could honestly, depending on the significance, be as early as the primaries, personal statement like Meng mentioned, for some schools, or sometimes it directly will ask you, are there any gaps or anything else you want to mention? And this would be the best opportunity to highlight. And I know you had said, Zhenya, what if someone doesn't see it? That's something that everyone's hoping for, but let's assume everything that is being submitted is being truly looked at and reviewed thoroughly. And you never want to leave anything up to interpretation, right? You're really left to these papers, essentially, these submissions to really, how would you summarize the depths of, your candidacy, who you are, what you can offer. So they might not know you, they might not know how hard you tried, and maybe yes, you did receive a less favorable grade and such course, and that's going to be on your transcript. And you want to mention why that is. And not mentioning it, could be someone could draw upon a different conclusion on why your GPA is the way it is, when really, you've worked hard, maybe you struggled with something was happening, and you actually gained so much with that experience. But I'm all in favor of actually discussing things and being transparent, and doing it in a tactful way is going to be more efficient and actually more effective than it is to kind of hoping and wishing that something is swept under the rug, if that makes sense.
No, that's great. Yes, thank you for clarifying that, because I think there is a fear that you might have to talk about it in detail in your personal statement or somewhere, a component that you would rather focus all the good things on, right? But when we discuss the specific gaps or setbacks, maybe you can tell us a little bit how a secondary essay could address it, and what kind of prompt, maybe when you don't have a direct prompt, like if you have any setbacks, talk about them, or if you have any gaps, talk about them, because I think you can give us advice on what kind of prompts in general we can use or our students can use to address these kinds of setbacks. Let's start with a very obvious one. That's probably what every medical student, every medical school hopeful wants to address is, how do you address if your GPA or MCAT, your statistics, are not what you really hope them to be? I know that, you know, some schools don't have strict cutoffs, if you will, but every school has expectations that they want their students and applicants to meet. So how do you address, though, if your stats are not on par with other matriculants?
I think, it's the same strategy that we would recommend for discussing any kind of negative experiences, these negatively charged histories that we're trying to address here. And I think what's important to remember is that, again, it's not necessary to have a perfect track record, but it's very important that you grow from each of your experiences. So what you should do ideally is just be candid about what happened, take responsibility if there's room for that, and you don't have to be very verbose about this. The more you say, the more you get off track, but just quite simply state what the issue was. But importantly, you want to transition to talking about what you got from the experience. These are your takeaways, what you learned, if you learned skills or knowledge, or if you gained values from the experience. Those are all good things to bring up. Essentially, you want to show them that you became a better person from all of this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then, where it's appropriate, you can take those takeaways, those learning outcomes, and talk about how they might apply to your future as a student or your future as a professional, because your learning outcomes from your past should make you a better candidate or more capable physician, whatever it is that you're pursuing in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And just to add more to that, with what Meng mentioned, it really doesn't matter the discrepancy. I know we're tackling GPA or test scores or anything of that nature. The strategy is exactly as Meng would mention, right? Being candid, taking accountability. The best things I think we've always told our students is just to be clear and to be concise, just briefly identify whatever that discrepancy was without harping too much on it, right? Without creating or even drawing upon it in a negative way, but looking at it from a standpoint of growth and progression. And one in which, as Meng mentioned, allowed you to learn, gave you the space, gave you the opportunities to learn or take away lessons in which hopefully at that point you would have addressed how you applied it, right? So if that's struggling in your courses in some of the earlier semesters, and you want to mention how you were able to increase time management, in which you maybe collaborated or you took initiative to get yourself a tutor, or you started approaching the professor more, going to the office, talking more, and realizing that communicating issues earlier on, and really at that point, in terms of admissions, when you're reading that, now I'm really looking at, wow, the maturity, the growth, the level of awareness and initiative. And I've almost, completely forgotten that this person maybe did less favorably in the first earlier semester. So I don't think so much it matters regardless of GPA, MCAT, or if you're lacking this or lacking that. The strategy is always the same in being clear, concise, taking accountability, not focusing on the problem, but focusing on what you did to overcome the problem. And then, like Meng said, and identifying what was learned from that. And I'm hoping at that point, if what was learned from that, then more than likely it was hopefully qualities that are appreciated within the profession.
I think it's really good that you guys mentioned the focus on growth and responsibility that you take for maybe your mistakes or your own lack of responsibility in when you were younger. But there are some experiences, I think, like failed courses or retaking the MCAT. When these kinds of things happen, and of course they are far from the end of the world, what kind of secondary prompts could you use? The secondary prompts you may receive do not directly ask you to talk about MCAT or failed courses, or what kind of prompts and essays could you use to actually address that?
Yeah. So the one that struck me, and I've helped students with in the past, is typically one about any sort of setbacks or failures. And it's usually set up in terms of a personal question, right? Tell us about an experience in which you did not succeed at something, or tell us about a time you failed, or even let's use less than harsh words like not succeeding in failure.
Yes.
Maybe a challenge. Tell us about a challenge that you learned to overcome. So you see something like that, I mean, you could really approach it in any way. But if you're at that point, you're like, hey, I haven't talked about that issue. I didn't talk about in this area, and I really think I need to address it because this and this happened, and this is giving me that space. Great. This is the challenge. Now, noting that in that question, it might not even suggest how you overcame it. It might just say, describe a challenge that you had. The reason I already went to the second part of that is, as Meg mentioned, you want to identify how you overcame something. So even if it was set up in a personal way of a negative question, negatively charged question, a setback, a challenge, a time you failed, even if the prompt didn't prompt you, I guess not to be redundant, to talk about how you overcame it, you should already at that point know that you need to identify or leave space, if you're limited, which more than likely you will be limited, to talk about how you overcame it. So sometimes it's set up like a personal question that's very vague. Sometimes the personal question is actually, very direct in the sense of like failure and not succeeding. And sometimes you might have, is there anything else that you'd like to say? Anything else that, an optional prompt, like something that was not addressed. And again, you have to take the entire application, the entirety of the application into context there. And if it was discussed, you don't necessarily need to be redundant at that point. Now, if there's something else outside of whatever academic gap or testing score, retaking, and what have you, and you want to address something else outside of that, again, the same strategy applies, right? You want to be brief, clear, identify the issue, taking accountability, and not, and I say that because I've had students in the past that, unfortunately circumstances happen without, that's not in their control. But you don't want to even, discuss those in a way that's deflecting any sort of responsibility, because yes, circumstances happen that are unfortunate, but you want to portray that maturity and that growth. And, typically with maturity and growth, it's someone that takes responsibility.
That was actually excellent segue into the next discussion, sort of, while MCAT is a one-time event that you sit down and you take it, and it's one day where you write the test and you get your score. GPA, of course, you work on, but extracurricular activities, if you're lacking in something, or you are, maybe don't have the experience or the level of experience that a medical school expects, it's not as easy to say, I had a bad day, like I had a bad test, or I had a bad, like experience with a teacher or something. This is, your life outside of academia, what you spent your time on outside of school, and how you prepared externally, if you will, just again, what kind of skills you learned, and how can a student who hasn't given the time, maybe enough time, to an extracurricular activity that is highly valued by their school of choice, how can that be addressed? And whether the student should, think of applying to a different school, for example, if that experience is lacking. How would you, what would be your tips or your strategy or your advice to the student? Doesn't, maybe they don't need to apply to the school, or what would you say?
Yeah, I think what you're hinting at there is something I would probably discuss with a student if that were the case, and they were working and I was working with them. If that particular type of activity is very highly valued by a specific school. If you're applying to a school where you see on MSAR 98% of people have research experience who get into that school, and you're that person who's lacking research experience, you know, you can hope to be in the 2%. I think maybe, you know, depending on how good the other parts of your application might be. But then you should also really consider focusing on schools where the accepted applicants' profiles are a better match to yours. That's one thing you can certainly consider. Just going in a different direction, though, you know, it's typically not directly asked, why don't you have X kind of experience? That's not a question that applicants typically need to answer at any point in the application process. You can think about why the admissions committee might want to see that kind of experience in your application, in your profile. And it's usually because they want to know that you have certain types of competencies. It's not because they want you to just check off the box and say, I've done research. They want to see certain kind of competencies that you've been developing through that kind of experience. So for research experience, they might be looking for, I don't know, scientific inquiry or critical thinking. Like those are skills that are transferable, number one, and number two, that you can gain from other types of experiences as well, not just research, although research might be the most direct one and the most obvious one. So for those types of skills, if you know that's what they're looking for, and you have other experiences in your history where you can actually highlight those very same skills just in a very different context, that might be something that you can do very, very strategically in your application to show that you have those specific competencies. So, you know, for example, maybe you haven't done lab research, but you started your own club, you've started your own company. I've talked to students who are entrepreneurs even, and they have to do market research or some kind of, you know, critical thinking, problem solving type of activity that led them to success in some very different endeavor, but something that uses the very same skills that they would use in a lab. That's something you can certainly highlight in those other experiences, not so much to make up for the research, but to show that, you know, you have those very same competencies that will benefit you in your future professional context.
I definitely agree with that. I think I have this exact standpoint as Meng, and it's not so much the activity sometimes as it is the qualities and the skills that you would gain from that activity. So if you have obtained those in different ways, then emphasizing, drawing on those clearly. Now, Jenny also mentioned about, you know, applying or not applying. So that would be like a different discussion altogether. But if it was a student and they were trying to apply to a program that required certain things, then that's a different discussion altogether, right? Like we have to really sit there and see what schools are appropriate, what the, you know, what is the likelihood, ideally at that point, that they would be competitive in that application cycle. So those would be more so preliminary conversations before we even get to it. But say someone actually applied this, yeah, exactly as Meng mentioned. And one thing I would say even further, and I've seen this with some of the students, is maybe perhaps they don't have that experience now, but maybe they've acquired or they've secured a position, say in research coming in the summer, but they haven't had it, so they can't talk about it, haven't experienced it. That is something that, you know, in terms of like future upcoming things that they're involved in, I would suggest to include. I wouldn't say, you know, hang on that alone, but it's something that's good to mention for admission. So whether that's I've gained this and this quality, and I know that, you know, this is going to be excellent for so-and-so, you know, whether that's attention to detail and anything of that nature. And I'm looking forward to applying these skills moving forward, where I've secured an internship as so-and-so. And you can briefly go into what you will do in the future. So I have seen that work out for students where, or they haven't secured, but they're interested, things that they're hoping to do in the future, some sort of like future opportunity. I'm really looking forward to diving more because I've learned so much about this topic, or I've gained so much exposure in my clinical experience. I'm looking to gain further experience in this area, and I'm hoping to work with so and so to do that. That's perfectly okay. You know, talking about those goals or those upcoming experiences that you haven't experienced yet are still critical, right? Because you're evaluating the person's motivation, but also their ability to put, you know, words into action, and not only gaining experience, but really going for the things that they're passionate about, hoping that those are the things that they're passionate about. So playing on the qualities, regardless if you don't have them, talking about any upcoming potential opportunities, but also upcoming areas that you're really hoping to learn more. Keyword being learning, because you know, learning because you're always learning as a student, right? So whether that you've even had brief exposure, you're more than likely going to want to continue learning and growing as a researcher. You know, learning more and getting more exposure in clinical or any sort of different types of shadowing work that you haven't done, right? You may have gotten exposure to one, but you're really interested in, you know, family medicine, or you're really interested in, you know, emergency. So yeah, even if you've had experience, for some, it could still be challenging because perhaps they still lack a specific type of experience. And that's how I would navigate that too.
When we talk about skill building, that requires time, right? So extracurricular activities, as much as exactly as Meg said, they're not a checkbox or, you know, I have this one and this one, but they are about showing that you are responsible, mature, dedicated individual. You know, doing a couple of days in a research lab is not gonna do anything, right? So if you were talking to a student who is thinking of applying but lacks a certain experience, some qualities that this experience would develop within them, would you ever suggest a gap year? To take a gap year to kind of get those, not check boxes checked, but to really bolster your, not only your application, but really your skills and like your preparedness for medical school? Would gap year be an advisable option for a student who's not up on, you know, as I often say, on par with other of his or her peers?
Yeah, I have actually. But in the circumstances where I've recommended a gap year, it was a conjoined decision, right? Like it's the student's journey at the end of the day, so you can't tell anyone what they should do, but you have to work with them. And I think that by the end of the session, we did come to the conclusion that, you know, the student felt rushed, like it was not their best foot forward. Similar to, you know, the MCAT test, you don't really want to do it more than once, right? There's a lot of time and there's a lot of money. And if you're, someone that says, hey, I'm just not ready. Some people, it's not even just that their application is not ready. They're not mentally ready to make that commitment, or they want that extra time to really solidify the experience and really solidify whether medicine is for them. And I applaud that, because a lot of times I do think that some students just like to go with, go through the motion of things. I'm finishing this and I'm now starting this. I took my tests, now I have to apply, then I have to start. So I do commend certain students that can come to that realization of this is not my year. But I also see it more applicable to those that would definitely benefit more from it. And it's not to say, hey, I don't have shadowing experience, I don't think I should apply this year. I think it really comes down to personally the student, right? Whatever circumstances that they're going through, but more so to that, I think it really has to be critical, right? If someone's GPA is, definitely not competitive, and they're just like, I don't feel confident, I also lack this and that. However, during this gap year, I'm hoping to do this, I'm hoping to do that, right? I actually have secured a shadowing experience. Okay, great. So that's going to be complementary depending on which schools you're looking for, but regardless, you're getting exposure. I'm also continuing on my research and I'm hoping to get published. Okay, so publication is going to happen in the summer, or, it's going to happen after that application period. I really want to see if, I want to pursue some sort of academics. whether it be a post-bac or anything that's going to be complementary and make my application more competitive. And it's not even just about making your application look good. I think it's at that point for the student, the growth. Like they are just generally hoping to grow, and in that growth period and solidifying the journey for them, they want to put their best foot forward. So 100% at that point, I would support and say, yes, that makes sense for you in this case.
What would be your advice, and how would a Canadian student looking to apply in American school go about finding an MD or DO, which is even more difficult for Canadian students? Meg, maybe you want to address this?
Sure, yeah. Well, actually, now that there's a lot of things happening online, I think it's become more accessible to students. You can now gain a certain amount of shadowing experience through virtual shadowing opportunities. So that's made it a lot easier, I think, for Canadian students because you can sign up for those types of opportunities. Now, you should look into probably the nature of some of the shadowing. Sometimes it's just kind of Q&A style, where you're not actually seeing the doctor in their element, in their context, doing their job. Those are probably the most valuable types of shadowing experiences, because the purpose of shadowing experiences is to give you exposure to the kind of work that a physician does, so that you can expect to do in the future. So those are probably the most valuable kind, where you can actually gain that exposure, because then you can actually talk about what you learned about the work of a physician in your application through those experiences. But yeah, there's virtual shadowing now. So if that's something you're worried about, then that's something I would get on right immediately, essentially.
Yeah, and I will add to that even if you don't get to go to the hospital and get to see, and a lot of that is due to restrictions, of course, it is still very valuable to hear a doctor speak about experiences or case studies, and then you really get to sit there and unpack it all. And you're sitting there trying to understand what happened, how do you approach a patient, what would you do? So I think that those are very fundamental. So that would definitely help. Yes, it could be still Q&A, but I think it's still very valuable. And I think that actually, even if anything, in the sense of communicating, you have more time to talk to the doctor about what happened, because usually in most cases with shadowing, the doctor's wrapping up the shift. Maybe you have some time to ask, hey, why did you say this? But the doctor's still working. So I do think that virtual is going to be very helpful. But I think that there's so many ways you can really get creative with this, whether that's reaching out to local hospitals, any sort of MDs, connecting with them, see what sort of exposure or observation that you could do within the confined boundaries that some hospitals could have. And you never know, at that point what that could look like, what that day could look like, whether that's just going to see a doctor on the break. If the doctor agrees to it, come sit down, we'll talk about any sort of things that I could talk about in a confidential manner, and I'll talk about how I'd address it. Or maybe there's some, a lot of MDs that want to help out students, that will, want to partner up and want to give them that and have that engagement. So I definitely think that whether it's virtual shadowing, honestly, any sort of involvement with the hospital where you could see how you could observe and just be a part of that environment will be extremely valuable to your awareness, your experiences, your lived experiences, and in turn application. Because again, we're trying to promote people to get experiences and exposure, not just fluff up their application, right? That's the best part of it. Is the good result of it is that they'll actually have a good application, and in the sense, hopefully they strategize on how to make it a good application. But that would be the best result. But yeah, I think that, like as Meg said, you could do virtual. There's so many different avenues. You just have to get creative, and you can't be stuck on that. I'm from Canada, shadowing's limited, and therefore I'm not even going to attempt.
Yeah, there's lots of different ways you can observe physicians at work too, not just through shadowing, but if you volunteer at a clinic or a hospital, which those positions obviously exist for Canadians. You know, like we talked about before, when you don't have one type of experience, you can think about what skills and values you can extract from other experiences that would fill in those gaps. You can do that as well with shadowing.
And one thing else I could add is that if you're, if you're missing patient interaction, there's also different ways to interact with patients. That doesn't necessarily have to be in a form of shadowing and acting as that student in shadowing. Similar to what Meng said with volunteering, there's a lot of nonprofits that have involvement and partnered up with hospitals in which you go visit patients, whether that's storytelling or volunteering, or I had students in the past that weren't able to secure a shadowing an opportunity with a physician, but they did secure a volunteer experience at a retirement home, and they were able to go and sit down and talk and play chess and learn about someone's experiences. And I think those are just as valuable. That communication is drawn from that. Compassion, empathy, anything you could really think of, like in terms of like what did you actually gain from that could be drawn out of those experiences, can happen, right? It's really up to you at that point, where the experience goes. But yeah, I agree.
And moving, from application components that are really in your control, in your power, let's move to one application component I think is less so, which are your recommendations. And things happen, as we've talked about. Something might have prevented you from receiving a recommendation or support from somebody you relied on, whether it's your research supervisor, a professor, or it may be that the professor that you really want to ask would just not fit a profile of recommender that your school wants to see. So how do you think, what is the best strategy to find the right referees that would fulfill those requirements? If you're worried that, let's say, they ask for 2 science professors and you can only provide 1, or a research supervisor who is out of town and is just not responding to your emails for some reason, what would be the strategy?
Well, first let's talk prevention, because I think, when the requirements are so specific, like some schools, like you said, do ask for specifically 2 science professors to give you reference letters, it restricts the amount of maneuverability that you have within those restrictions. So you want to do everything in your power to ensure that you meet those requirements. So some of the things you can do preemptively are to plan for more references than you need. That's something you should definitely do. So if you need to have 2 science professors, plan ahead and see if you can get 3 science professors on board to provide you a letter. You can submit more letters than you need on the systems typically. So it wouldn't hurt you to have more than what you need. And give each person enough time to work on the letters. Make sure you start talking to them early and I would say give them at least 2 months from the time they say yes to the time that it's due, and give them periodic reminders in the form of, a nice cordial email or something to say, hey, and you can update them with any updates that you have as well, and just remind them from time to time that there is this letter that you would really appreciate if they could complete by such and such date. Now, usually people are pretty responsible when they're at that level, and if they promised you something and you remind them from time to time, they will get it done. If for some reason things fall through with one of them, then at least you have your backup. You can still have the number of letters that you need. I mean, it's hard when you don't get those letters, but I think sometimes you can you can call into the school and ask if they would accept, for example, a different letter or an alternative. Sometimes with these things, it's very school specific. So you don't want to just assume across the board that something is okay if one says it's okay versus another. You should probably check with each and every one of your schools just to make sure. Ronza, did you have anything?
Yeah, I think the most critical thing that anyone listening can take away from that is preventative and being proactive and setting those relationships good from the beginning, right? Establishing good connections with professors and knowing that they have hundreds, if not thousands, of students that they're connecting with, and they have so many people asking them for a letter of reference. So you know, to Meng's point of giving them time, but also you want to make sure that you've established a relationship, you know, a good professional relationship where they could really attest to X, Y, and Z in your letter of reference. So whether that's visiting them and the office hours, asking them questions, having those earlier conversations earlier on from in your bio professor. Yeah, you know, I'm really interested and I'm hoping to apply to medical school, and you know, I've really enjoyed your course. I'm going to take your upcoming course, and you're someone that I really value, and I'd love to know, you know, if the time's right, then you would be able to give me a letter of reference. Having those conversations earlier on, setting that earlier on. And yeah, to Meng's point, you know, asking more people, but also I think giving them clear guidelines like, hey, so, you know, if you took a course and you had someone for a year and you haven't talked to them and lost touch in a while, they're probably going to have forgotten a lot of those conversations, your grades. Maybe they might have an idea what you ended up with in the course. Like, yeah, you were pretty good. You ended up with an A, whatever the case might be. Having that clear email, or actually, honestly, I would recommend if it's possible, having an in-person meeting, reaching out to so-and-so, hey, it's been very long. I took your da-da-da course. Maybe you took, hopefully at that point, 2 courses, or maybe you worked with them on a research, or maybe you had a lab, something of continuation where you were with them in a period of time that is substantial for them to actually vouch for you. And just clearly say, you know, I'm hoping to apply in this upcoming cycle, and I wanted to see if you could cover or give me a strong letter of reference, and hoping to tackle, you know, and if you want to even identify the areas in which you got exposure in their classroom or their lab or their research, you can clearly indicate that in the email. And if you are seeing them in person, you can elaborate on that. I think that would be very helpful, and I could speed things along also, because a lot of times these, like, you know, professors, researchers are very busy. But I would say your focus should be striving to get the professors or the physicians, or, you know, the whole concept is who has that knowledge and credibility to voice about your future performance in the relevant setting, right? Of course, it'd be great to have, you know, if you were involved in something else where, you know, it wasn't, you know, they said you could apply one other letter, and you did, you know, you're a part of some sort of volunteer experience where you're overseeing everything and you work closely with one of the directors, and they can vouch for your time management, and all that is great. But, you know, we have to really come back to the notion that these letter of references are also speaking to your future profession. And a lot of times that is limited to certain individuals. So that means there's more emphasis on starting early with getting that, you know, getting those, aligning those individuals earlier on, maintaining communication, and maintaining, you know, your networking too, right? Like, you're becoming a professional and you're hoping to network at that point. So I would say start visiting office hours, start asking questions, start having those conversations earlier on. And if that professor says, hey, you know, I'm going on sabbatical, I'm going to be really busy, I can't do it, then start asking, you know, what would be the next avenue? Who can I, like, who could be the next person that I could ask? I think that would help you and spare you a lot of time and struggle near the end.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really long-term planning, if you will. So that's really important. And let's say, you know, you've done all you can, you addressed all these little setbacks you experience in your applications. You tried your best to portray yourself as the perfect candidate, and you are invited to the interview. how likely do you think it is that the interview committee will ask you to speak to any of these, weaknesses in your application? Because obviously, if they invite you, that means that those red flags that you perhaps worried about so much, they're not that, significant if they actually invited you. So should the student still prepare to discuss these?
I think it's worth mentioning that there is a clear division between open interviews and closed interviews, but I've always suggested that the strategy really doesn't change for either, right? So open being that they already have your file, they could literally say, hey, I noticed you had this in this course, or hey, I noticed that you took a bit of a break, or this and this happened, could you explain it? So in that concept, you definitely need to be prepared because it's an open interview. They're going to go into your application, or you have a closed where they might not directly ask about in a research experience, a gap or a less favorable grade, and they might just say, tell us about a setback in your journey. How did you overcome it? Or tell us about a challenge. Again, it goes back to those prompts like in the secondaries or in the application cycle where they kind of leave it vague. And I would say, and I've always said to students, come with a handful of experiences in your back pocket. And I don't mean in the sense of like being robotic and how you rehearsed it, but in the sense of I briefly knew the mission, the organization, if it's obviously mission-based or organization-based or the volunteer, I knew what took place. I knew my responsibilities, right? If there was an issue, okay, great, you remember the issue. Maybe you had a fundraiser in which you had to secure 3 speakers and it was this big, had this budget, and you maybe did not secure 3 speakers because you delegated to someone that stopped showing up and they didn't really take it. And then you, being the president of this organization, you weren't able to secure last minute. So you don't want to deflect it and say so-and-so did not secure it, and that way we got it. You would say you take responsibility, right? Again, similar to the concepts that we mentioned earlier, Meng had mentioned earlier, you would highlight where you grew from it, whether that's organization, communicating earlier on, checking up, maybe following up with someone that's not showing up, taking that leadership, taking that initiative and trying to be preventative, or maybe voicing an issue and reporting that issue to whoever the senior was at that time. So I think in those instances, it's not so much the likelihood that it's going to come up, just prepare. Prepare to have a handful of personal experiences where you could talk about challenges, talk about even success, and noting what did you learn, right? So whether it's open or closed, someone could catch you off guard and ask about that experience you were hoping they did not directly ask about. Be prepared for it. Or you could be drawn to it in another way, in a vague question.
I think I will then, ask a very specific question, a very common interview question that I think can be easily used to address this is, what else would you like us to know about you? Or what else should we know about your application or your candidacy? Should a student in an interview take this as an opportunity to address a setback, or should they rather focus on something great about them? Like the example of when they were an excellent student or an excellent communicator, or can they use this to, to reveal something about themselves that they've already maybe talked about in the application, but they want to, full disclosure. I do not want, as Ronza said, any uncertainties, any interpretation to happen. So I'll use this chance to discuss something I failed at, let's say.
Yeah, that's a really good question. If this question is asked, it's usually one of the last questions. So there's that as well, because it's the last thing that you tell the interviewer before you leave that interview. So it definitely adds a little bit of extra pressure when you're making that decision. It honestly probably depends on the setback or the gap that you're considering. If it's something that probably most other applicants have experienced something similar to. It probably doesn't need to get brought up again, especially if you've already addressed it. But either way, it doesn't really matter what your decision is, whether you choose to talk about something positive or whether you choose to bring up something that you want to clarify, because I mean, the beginning will be different because one will be positive, one will be negative, but your ultimate goal, where you're going towards at the end of your answer, is to showcase your maturity, professionalism, your growth through either of those experiences, the positive or the negative, right? So ultimately, that's what the strategy does, that we've been kind of sharing and then highlighting throughout this conversation, is that you, no matter whether your experience that you're talking about is positive or negative, you talk about your takeaways, what you learn from the experience, how it makes you a better person, how it makes you a stronger candidate at the end of the day, right? So as long as you can end on that and potential application, then it's okay, right? And if there's something you feel you haven't talked about sufficiently, or you haven't really clarified, had no other chance to clear the air about something in your application, that's certainly okay, as long as you don't end on the negative part of that experience, as long as you take that and transform it into an opportunity to showcase a strength of yours, essentially.
I did want to add 2 points actually that Meng beautifully highlighted. So the impression, right, the lasting impression, we always talk about primacy and recency here at BeMo, and that just caters to, research indicates people remember the first few moments and the last few moments, and that definitely comes into play in an interview, right? The first few moments, that greeting, the hi sets the tones, and then the last few moments, right? As Meng mentioned, talking about ending on a strong note, right? The growth, highlighting that, yes, this happened, highlighting this and how I overcame it, and why those skills or those qualities are so critical moving forward, because I'm going to start communicating early effectively. I'm going to be more compassionate to others that come from a different struggle, and realizing that because this happened. One thing I do also want to mention and remind everyone is, if there's anything you discuss in an application that you don't feel comfortable bringing up in an interview, probably don't mention it in an application, because you can't guarantee that it won't be talked about in the interview. And I say this because I've had students in the past that are very emotional around a topic, and that could be surrounding a discrepancy. In fact, it was in some cases surrounding a discrepancy or a circumstance that happened, and the student got emotional, and I would remind them saying, you need to be able to communicate this in an effective way. In an interview, should it come up. So if you don't feel comfortable talking about something in an interview, then you need to really reconsider how to put that in the application, or whether that's something that you should be indulging in the application. So that's actually something that most students kind of forget. That's a very important.
All right. Well, I think this concludes our discussion today for this particular topic. I think we all learned a lot, and I hope you enjoyed our tips on how to talk about gaps, setbacks, and academic failure. And ladies, thank you so much for your time and your invaluable advice and your knowledge. And I will see you next time.
Thanks so much for watching. If you'd like us to help you achieve your academic and professional goals, schedule a free strategy call by visiting BeMoFreeStrategy.com. If you have any questions about this video, let us know in the comments section and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Don't forget that we're giving away Amazon gift cards every week to best comments and questions, so comment below for a chance to win.